F1 Challenge would be endorsed and fully licensed by the Formula 1 franchise, being developed for the Sega Saturn and releasing in 1995. But while it is fully endorsed and has all of the typical features, it has all of the licensed drivers and teams from the 1995 Formula 1 racing season. The game would only feature 3 main circuits from the season itself, with Hockenheim in Germany, Monte Carlo and Suzuka in Japan, and having 3 other tracks based on fictional cities with different configurations. But out of the 13 teams and 26 drivers, the game only allows the player to play as 5 drivers, initially with Michael Schumacher, Damon Hill, John Lacey, Yukio Katayama and Mika Hakkinen. The other teams and drivers are there and correctly modelled but are unselectable. The game itself plays very similar from other titles produced around the time by Sega, as it's a form of an arcade game but also mixes in simulation elements, even taking inspiration as such from games like Virtua Racing and Daytona USA, even Sega Touring Car Championship. However, in F1 Challenge, the handling physics doesn't rely on power sliding or drifting. Instead, the driving physics are a lot more precise and driver focused, with the aim is to maintain a racing line while trying to make sure that you have enough grip to stay on the road. With these elements in mind, the game actually worked really well with the additional peripherals and controller features that you could also gain access to with the analog controller, and especially even with the steering wheel. And for the time of its release, the game was well received. While it was often seen as inferior to Daytona USA and even Sega Rally Championship, but it added and gave players a completely different look into racing games, and was among the most realistic seen on consoles of that time. But it wouldn't be for long, because in early of 1996, with the PlayStation from Sony reaching massive heights of success very quickly, it wouldn't be long before they would develop and publish their own Formula 1 game, also being endorsed by the F1 brand and license. But this would end up becoming one of the most realistic and detailed looking racing games of its generation, simply titled Formula 1, being developed by Bizarre Creations and Psygnosis. It would feature all of the racing teams, all of the tracks, all of the drivers, but the differences between that and F1 Challenge was that in Formula 1 on the PlayStation, you had access to everything, all of the tracks you could race as, all of the drivers across all of the teams. For its time, it was the best simulation racing experience that you could have on any console. So while F1 Challenge did have a short run of success to some degree, by the time Formula 1 came out in the PlayStation, it completely knocked this out of the park. But in saying that, not everybody at the time would have had access to either a Sega Saturn or a PlayStation, because very few people, if any, had both. You were either one or the other. For most of us growing up, there is a good chance, like myself, would have grown up with the PlayStation more predominantly. But that doesn't take away from the Sega Saturn and the games that it offered. F1 Challenge, yes, is fairly lacking and limited compared to other games of a similar type. But considering this was an earlier type of game, remember that games were still breaking new grounds. They were still trying and testing different ideas. But once one came out, it wouldn't be too long afterward where another would come out on a different platform or even in the arcade that would expand upon all of those elements. And in this case, with Formula 1 on the PlayStation, just completely changing the landscape of racing games, because it had almost a true to life aesthetic. Graphics and the visuals were outright stunning. One of the best looking games on the PlayStation itself to really push the console to its limits, only bettered by its later sequel with Formula 1 97, and to this day, in my opinion, they're still the 2 best Formula 1 games on the PlayStation, hands down. But going back to the Saturn, it still has its own collection of racing games that are definitely worth exploring and experiencing. And in fairness, F1 Challenge, yes, there are limitations, but haven't spent time playing it, it is a hidden gem. And considering it's an early game, it was very impressive in what it tried to do. It had, without a doubt, some of the best handling physics of any racing game of that time. I can definitely say that from having played it, especially when you compare it to other racing games that were released in and around that time as well. If you know what you're doing, it can almost make you feel like as if you are a professional driver. You get a really good sense of satisfaction and reward from being able to maintain your racing lines and even using correct overtaking procedures and so forth. Yes, it's tricky and it does get more difficult the further into the game that you get, and especially on certain tracks. If you play on likes of the more narrower style tracks with the likes of Monte Carlo, yeah, it's challenging but very rewarding. The one thing I will say about it compared to other games of a similar type, most racing games would usually give you maybe 2 or 3 laps per race maximum. This one here, you are forced into doing 8 to 10 lap races, so it can take you anywhere between 10 and 15 minutes, sometimes even more, to finish a race, which by that point, if you're only looking for a casual playthrough, you'll be exhausted by the end of it. But hardcore players and gamers that were really into this would have got a lot out of it. But yeah, it's a reflection of its time, make no mistake. It is a good game. It's a hidden gem in fairness on the Sega Saturn. Not many people talk about it. I suppose, like I said, with the Formula 1 games that were coming out on the PlayStation, a lot of games on other systems literally were overlooked from the get-go. They didn't really have a look in at all once those games started to appeal. So it often left a lot of developers and companies always playing catch-up, trying to compete with that narrative, which to many wasn't a feasible thing or an option. But still, for what it does present, it was definitely a step up from games that came before it. But in a lot of ways, it also did inspire a lot of games that came after it too. And there is a lot to be said about that. Really, there is. Yeah, it's interesting. Definitely requires a lot of patience and just time to put into it, because the races are very long, I will say. But it is a very solid, grounded and overall fun experience. But if you're looking for a more arcade feel on the Sega Saturn, you would be better to go with the likes of Sega Rally, Daytona USA and the other games that are out there. But if you want a more simulation focused experience, this would be the game to go to. I just think that if it did have all of the tracks, because like it has all of the licenses, it has all of the teams, if it did have at least most of the tracks from the F1 season, I definitely think it would have been a massive contender to the games on the PlayStation. But for whatever reason, it just wasn't meant to be. But at the same time, it's not necessarily a bad thing either. Still a fun game, definitely worth trying. But what did you think of it? Did you enjoy this game as much as the other games on the Sega Saturn?